"This land will be mine very soon, Mr. Vance. The old woman doesn't understand business anymore, nor does she know what she's standing on." My own blood said those words while I was holding the tray 6 feet behind her back. I am Margaret. I am 74 years old, and I have spent my entire life cultivating roots so that others could bloom. They look at me and see a widow with slow hands, but they are completely blind to the digital padlocks I have learned to lock. The air that Tuesday afternoon had that thick, sticky weight that always comes right before the summer storms in our valley. It was the kind of heat that clings to your skin, the kind that made the cicadas sing with a deafening urgency high up in the oak branches. From the kitchen window, I had spent over an hour watching the dirt road that connected the main entrance of Oak Creek Farm to the paved highway. The golden dust was still floating in the air, kicked up by the neighbors' tractors hours earlier. The house was an old build with thick walls and high wooden ceilings, keeping a deceptive coolness inside. It was the sanctuary that my husband Arthur and I had built, stone by stone, dollar by dollar, over 40 years of working the fields. Arthur had passed away 5 years ago. His heart, tired of fighting against the winter freezes, the droughts, and the stubborn weather, simply stopped one winter night while he slept beside me. Since then, silence had become my only constant companion. But it was not an empty silence. It was full of memories. The echo of his footsteps down the hallway, the scrape of his leather boots against the tile floor in the entryway. I had learned to live with that gentle ghost. I kept the farm standing. I made sure the walnut trees got their yearly pruning, that the fences were painted before the rainy season, and that the numbers, those same numbers that used to scare Arthur so much, balanced perfectly at the end of every month. And then there was Emily, my only daughter, the girl for whom we had sacrificed our own youth, the one for whom we had sold our first almond harvest at a massive discount just to pay for her private school in Chicago, the one for whom I had worn the same raw wool coat for 12 winters in a row, just so she would never go without a new dress for her school dances. Emily had left for the city at 18, and little by little, the concrete pavement had erased the smell of wet earth from her memory. Her visits had become rare, measured in mere hours. They were always accompanied by a nervous rush, stolen glances at her cell phone screen, and excuses about urgent meetings and clients who simply could not wait. The day before, her phone call had caught me by surprise while I was kneading dough for some bread. "Mom, I am going to come visit you tomorrow afternoon," she had said, her voice unusually high-pitched and vibrating with an energy I could not quite place. "I am bringing a friend, someone from the city who needs to get away from the noise and breathe some fresh air. Bake something nice, okay? Nothing too heavy. He is a man of refined tastes." I had smiled, wiping the flour from my hands onto my apron. A mother always waits. A mother always holds on to the hope that her child's return is genuine. So I spent the entire morning in the kitchen. I beat the eggs and sugar until the mixture formed a perfect ribbon. I zested the brightest yellow lemons from our backyard orchard. I fired up the big oven and baked that moist lemon pound cake she used to love so much when she was just a little girl with scraped knees from climbing trees. I took the bottle green porcelain cups with the gold rims out of the dining room display cabinet. They were my most prized treasure when it came to dishware. Arthur and I had bought them on a trip to Chicago to celebrate our 10th wedding anniversary. They were delicate, fine, almost translucent if you held them up to the light. For years, they had only seen the light of day on Christmases or baptisms. I washed them carefully under the faucet, drying them with a clean cotton cloth, feeling the fragility of the ceramic beneath my arthritic fingers. My knuckles were not the same as they used to be. They were swollen, scarred by decades of sinking my hands into the cold dirt to pull weeds up by their roots. But my pulse was still steady. When I heard the crunch of thick tires on the gravel driveway, my heart gave a little skip of anticipation. I peeked out from behind the lace curtain in the kitchen. It was a massive vehicle, black, shiny, a block of metal and tinted windows that looked completely out of place among the hydrangeas and rose bushes flanking the front porch. The driver's door opened first, and a man stepped out. He was not your typical friend looking for fresh air. He wore an impeccably tailored gray suit, no tie, but with a shirt so blindingly white it hurt your eyes under the 3 o'clock sun. A widescreen smartwatch flashed on his left wrist. He walked with measured steps, evaluating the land not like someone admiring nature, but like someone calculating square footage. Then Emily stepped out. She was wearing white linen pants and high heels that immediately began to sink into the loose dirt of the pathway. I saw her curse under her breath, shaking her foot with a look of deep disgust. That was the first sharp pain in my chest, the contempt on her face as she looked at the very soil that had fed her, the land that had paid for her luxuries and her education. She walked up to the man, touched his arm with a forced familiarity, and pointed toward the old wooden barn where we kept the large tools and the tractor. They spoke in low voices, nodding. I could not hear what they were saying from the window, but their body language was loud and clear. They were appraising my life. They decided not to come inside right away. They made themselves comfortable on the wicker chairs out on the wraparound porch. Those were the exact same chairs where Arthur and I used to sit and drink iced tea while we watched the sun go down behind the ridgeline. I got the coffee ready. I didn't use the electric coffee maker. I used the old French press. The aroma of freshly ground coffee beans flooded the kitchen, mixing with the sweet citrus scent of the pound cake that was already sitting on a glass platter. I sliced the pieces very carefully. I arranged everything on the heavy silver tray, the one with the engraved handles. The green cups, the shiny spoons, the little pitcher of warm milk, the sugar cubes. Everything was perfect. Everything was exactly as expected from an elderly mother hosting guests. I walked slowly down the main hallway of the house. The hardwood floorboards creaked softly beneath my canvas slippers. I know every single sound in this house. I know exactly which board to step on to stay quiet and which one to avoid if I don't want to wake anyone up. On the walls, the framed photographs watched me as I walked by. Arthur in his straw hat smiling at the camera, Emily at 5 years old holding a newborn lamb, myself, much younger with my black hair tied back in a braid, leaning against the wire fence, an entire lifetime hanging in wooden frames. As I got closer to the double doors leading out to the porch, I stopped. The doors were cracked open to let the breeze in. I was standing in the shadows of the hallway, completely hidden from their sight. I lifted my foot to take the final step and announce my presence, but the man's voice, clear and deep, nailed me to the floor. "This is a magnificent stretch of land, Emily. The survey reports you sent over do not do it justice," said the man, whom I would later know as Mr. Vance. I heard the click of a lighter, followed by the sharp, bitter smell of cigar smoke. The terrain has the perfect slope for the cabins on the west side. But the property title is the main issue. Are you absolutely certain your mother is willing to sign over full control? This eco-resort project requires a complete transfer of ownership. My investors in Chicago are not going to put down a single dime if they have to deal with life estates, shared signatures, or the sudden whims of an old woman. We need this land completely clean, legally and physically. The weight of the tray in my hands seemed to multiply by 10. The silver edge dug sharply into my palms. I stopped breathing. I waited for my daughter's answer. I waited for the woman I had raised, the little girl I had taught how to walk on that very porch, to stand up and defend our home. I waited for her to say that this house was not for sale, that her mother was not a burden, that the walnut trees her father had planted with his own 2 hands were not going to be ripped out of the earth just to build luxury cabins for strangers. But what I heard instead was a laugh, a short, dry laugh, completely stripped of any warmth. "Do not worry about that, Vance," Emily said, and her voice sounded so cold, so calculating, that for a split second I doubted it was even her. "My lawyer is already putting the paperwork together. She will sign the general power of attorney next week." I am going to tell her it is a mandatory county procedure to update the agricultural taxes and avoid fines. She is terrified of owing money to the government. This land will be mine very soon, Mr. Vance. The old woman doesn't understand business anymore, nor does she know what she's standing on. She lives in the past, watering her little plants and dusting furniture. With a couple of legal papers drafted in confusing jargon, she will hand everything over to me without even reading the fine print. She is not going to ask a single question. She trusts me blindly. The world simply stopped. The song of the cicadas seemed to fade away, swallowed by a thick ringing that crawled from the back of my neck all the way up to my ears. The old woman doesn't understand business. The old woman doesn't know what she's standing on. My hands started to tremble. The tiny clinking of the spoons against the green porcelain saucers threatened to give me away. I clenched my teeth so hard that I felt a sharp pain in my jaw. I closed my eyes. In the darkness behind my eyelids, I saw the image of Emily crying with a fever at 10 years old, and myself placing cold washcloths on her forehead for 3 dawns in a row. I saw Arthur selling his favorite horse just to pay her tuition for law school. I saw all the sacrifices, all the quiet struggles, all the plates of food I took right out of my own mouth so that she could have extra. And there she was, sitting in her dead father's chair, offering my life up as a sacrifice just to please some man in a shiny suit. She was robbing me, not with a gun, but with my own love, using my trust as a knife. The pain was a massive wave, a physical blow that completely knocked the wind out of me. I felt my knees buckle, feeling like the sorrow was going to drag me right down to the hardwood floor, like it was going to break me apart right then and there in a puddle of useless tears. But then, as the pain settled deep into my stomach, something else began to rise from the very bottom of my gut, a cold spark, a hardened piece of steel. The sentimental woman, the mother willing to give up her life, stepped aside and closed the door behind her. In her place, someone entirely different stood tall, a sentinel. I tightened my grip on the tray. The trembling in my hands vanished completely. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the smell of the stranger's tobacco and the dust of my own land. They thought I was a relic, an old piece of furniture that was only good for making jams and baking cakes. They thought the modern world of contracts and finances just flew right over my head, all because I wore long skirts and kept my gray hair tied up in a bun. Emily had forgotten who really managed the farm's accounts when her father was alive. She had forgotten who spent countless sleepless nights cross-referencing data, checking international market quotes, and managing the transition from paper ledgers to encrypted spreadsheets. I pushed the double doors open with my shoulder and stepped out onto the porch. The sunlight hit my face. Emily was leaning forward, flashing a conspiratorial smile at the investor. But the moment she heard my footsteps, her posture changed instantly. She shot straight up. The predatory smile vanished, and in its place, the mask of the loving, devoted daughter slid right back on. "Oh, Mom," she exclaimed, with a sweet, sugary voice that turned my stomach. "I was just telling Mr. Vance how beautiful you keep the garden. That smells amazing. Did you make the lemon cake?" I walked over to the small wrought iron table sitting between them. I did not say a single word. My face was a mask of solid stone. Mr. Vance put his cigar out in the clay ashtray and shot me a look that was trying to be polite, but only managed to come off as deeply condescending. "Mrs. Margaret, it is a pleasure to meet you," he said, extending a hand. "Your daughter has told me wonderful things about this place. It is a corner of absolute peace." I did not shake his hand. Both of my hands were busy holding the silver tray. I looked him dead in the eyes, dark, calculating eyes. And then I looked at my daughter. I kept quiet. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. Silence carries its own weight. It has a gravity that makes people uncomfortable when they are used to filling the air with lies. Emily swallowed hard, shifting restlessly in her wicker chair. "Mom, let me help you," she said, reaching her hands out toward the tray. I pulled back just a fraction of an inch, just enough to reject her help without making a sudden scene. I leaned in and with absolute precision began to serve. First, I picked up a green cup and placed it in front of Mr. Vance, then the small plate. Then I poured the black coffee, the dark liquid steaming in the warm afternoon air. After that, I turned to Emily. I set down her cup. I poured her coffee. I placed the platter with the slices of lemon cake right in the center of the table. I set down the little milk pitcher. I did not make a single sound. There was no typical, "How are you doing?" or "Did you have a good drive down?" There were no polite smiles, no tender looks. The contrast between the sweetness of what I was serving and the freezing coldness of my movements was absolute. "Mom, are you okay?" Emily asked. And for the very first time all afternoon, I heard a glimmer of genuine doubt in her voice. The silence was suffocating her. I finished setting down the final spoon. I stood up straight. I stared right at her. I did not see my daughter. I saw a trespasser. I saw someone who was willing to dig up her own father's grave just to sell the plot. I held her gaze until she finally looked down, entirely unable to bear the heavy weight of my scrutiny. I did not need to yell. I did not need to make a scene in front of the stranger, or cry, or accuse her of what I had just heard. Causing a scene is the last resort for people who have no power. I, on the other hand, knew exactly what I needed to do. I picked up the silver tray, now empty of cups and plates, and turned around. "Mom," Emily called out behind my back, her voice slightly tense, "are you not going to sit down and have some coffee with us?" I didn't turn around. I didn't speed up my walking. I went right back inside the house, letting the double doors slowly swing shut behind me. The contrast between the blinding light of the porch and the cool shadows of the hallway wrapped around me. I walked back down that same path of hardwood floors. I walked right past the kitchen. I walked past Arthur's portrait hanging on the wall. My steps were rhythmic, completely decided. The pain had been boxed up, locked away in a deep drawer inside my chest, one that I would not open again until the job was finally done. I reached the end of the hallway where my bedroom was. It was a spacious, austere room, dominated by the large king-size bed that was now far too big for just me. Over in the corner, right next to the window overlooking the lemon orchard, sat my old oak desk. Resting on top of it was my laptop, closed, silent, and plugged into the wall. I stepped into the room. I set the silver tray down on the dresser, right next to the mirror. The metal made a dull thud against the wood. I stood in the middle of the room for a moment, listening to the muffled murmurs drifting in from the outside porch. Emily was probably already telling Mr. Vance that I was just tired. That old age made me grumpy, and that he shouldn't read too much into my silence. She would be spinning her little webs out there, entirely certain of her victory, completely convinced that her poor, elderly mother was in her bedroom praying a rosary or taking a nap. I walked over to the oak desk. I sat down in the chair, feeling the firm backrest against my spine. I reached out my hands. Those widow's hands they mocked so much, those hands that were supposedly only good for watering little plants. And I lifted the lid of the laptop. The screen flickered to life, illuminating my face with a cold blue glow in the dim light of the bedroom. I looked over at the solid wood door of my room. With a calm movement, I stood up, walked over to it, grabbed the brass doorknob, and pushed it shut. The metal latch clicked into the frame with a dry, firm, definitive snap, separating me from the rest of the house and from the rest of the world. Click. And I was left alone in front of the screen. The blue glare illuminated the wrinkles on my hands, those exact same hands that my own daughter had just declared useless for the business world. The silence in my bedroom was absolute, barely interrupted by the faint, almost unnoticeable hum of the laptop's internal fan. Outside, the afternoon heat continued to crush the valley, and through the closed window, I could hear the distant echo of Mr. Vance's voice. He was probably still out there, calculating how many acres of my life he was going to pave over. I stared at the window's desktop for a few seconds. The background image was a photograph of the walnut trees in autumn, a sea of golden leaves that Arthur and I had planted during our very first decade of marriage. I took a deep breath, letting the air slowly fill my lungs, forcing my heart back into a normal rhythm. The sharp pain that had pierced my chest out on the porch was transforming. It was no longer an open wound bleeding with sorrow. Now it was a solid block of ice, cold, heavy, and perfectly clear. The mother who constantly justified her daughter's absences, the one who baked pound cakes hoping to buy just a tiny bit of affection. She'd stayed out there, right next to those green porcelain cups. The woman sitting in front of this screen was the sentinel, the guardian of everything we had built. I moved the mouse with a steady hand. I double-clicked on the hidden folder tucked into the bottom right corner. The screen prompted me for a password. Emily always laughed at me whenever I tried to use a smartphone, mocking how slow I was at typing out text messages. She honestly believed that my grasp of technology was strictly limited to turning on the TV and answering phone calls. She was completely oblivious to the fact that during the last 10 years of her father's life, when the numbers started dancing in Arthur's head from all the stress and exhaustion, I had sat up for entire nights just studying. I had taken online courses in agricultural accounting. I had learned how to manage complex spreadsheets, and I had digitized every single receipt, every invoice, and every title deed to our property. Arthur hated banks and modern paperwork, so I became his shield. I typed in the password. It wasn't a birthday, nor was it the name of a childhood pet. It was a 16-character alphanumeric sequence that I changed every 6 months. The folder opened up, revealing the absolute financial heart of Oak Creek Farm. I didn't waste any time looking at our savings accounts. I went straight to the internet browser and opened the official county property registry portal. I had my own private username and password, credentials the government required from major agricultural producers in the area to speed up tax procedures. The page took a few seconds to load, the little circular icon spinning right in the center of the screen, while my pulse remained completely calm. When the dashboard finally appeared, I clicked on the parcel status inquiry section. I entered the exact cadastral survey number for our farm. The system blinked and displayed the recent history. My eyes scanned the lines of dark gray text against the bright white background, and there it was, the digital footprint of treason. Exactly 4 days ago, a law firm in Chicago had requested an urgent title search and ownership report on my property. The name of the applicant was a junior partner at the exact same firm where Emily worked as an external consultant. But that wasn't even the worst part. Under the Pending Procedures tab, there was a county file number that had been opened that very morning. The title of the filing was as clear as the water in our creek. Request for approval of transfer of ownership via irrevocable special power of attorney. An irrevocable power of attorney. Emily did not just want me to sign a simple authorization to manage things. She wanted a document that would strip me of absolutely all control. A power of attorney that could not be revoked or canceled, not even if I changed my mind the very next day. She wanted total, unchecked authority to sell, subdivide, and liquidate her father's land to Mr. Vance, leaving me with, if I was lucky, some miserable little pension and a rented room in some gray city where I wouldn't bother anyone. "The old woman doesn't know what she's standing on," she had said. I closed my eyes for a moment, feeling the harsh sting of disappointment burning the back of my eyelids. We had paid for her law degree by selling our very best tractor. We had eaten meatless lentil stew for months on end, just so she could afford to buy her heavy law books. And now she was using that exact same knowledge, that very same legal machinery that we had financed with our own sweat, to strip us of everything. I opened my eyes. The time for sadness was officially over. It was time to get to work. I picked up my cell phone, a thick, heavy device with a rugged black case resting right next to the laptop. I scrolled through my contact list and hit the call button. I brought the receiver to my ear, listening to the dial tone. 1, 2. On the third ring, a deep, measured, and highly formal voice answered on the other end of the line. Mitchell Law Office, good afternoon, this is Thomas Mitchell speaking. Thomas, I said, my voice sounding much firmer and deeper than I expected. It is Margaret, I need to talk to you. Right now. There was a brief pause on the other end. Thomas Mitchell was not just the lead notary and attorney in the neighboring town. He was a family friend of over 30 years. He had known Arthur since they were both young men, and he had been the legal architect behind every major move we had ever made. He was a man of the old school, the kind of man who still wore a full three-piece suit in the dead of July, and who truly believed that a firm handshake was worth far more than any printed contract. Margaret, dear, what a joy to hear from you, Thomas said, though his professional tone softened instantly, shifting into a note of genuine concern. Is everything all right out at the farm? I was actually just thinking about you this morning. No, Thomas, everything is not all right. I need to ask you a very direct question, and I want the absolute truth with no sugarcoating. Did anyone from a law firm in Chicago contact you this week asking for certified copies of the original farm deeds? The silence that followed was incredibly thick, loaded with an uncomfortable shock. I could hear the distinct sound of a leather chair squeaking, as if Thomas had just sat straight up at his desk. Yes, he finally answered, his voice dropping a full octave. Yesterday afternoon, a very arrogant young attorney called me. He told me he was representing Emily and that they needed certified copies of the original titles to initiate a county tax update procedure. It struck me as highly unusual that you did not call me first, Margaret. I told that young man that without your express in-person authorization, I do not move a single piece of paper out of my safe. I was actually planning on calling you tonight to ask you what on earth this was all about. You did the right thing by not giving him anything, Thomas. I thank you from the bottom of my heart. Margaret, what exactly is going on? The lawyer asked, the tone of alarm now fully evident in his voice. That attorney mentioned something about your health. He heavily implied that you were having, and I am quoting him here, memory difficulties, and that Emily was stepping in to assume legal responsibility for your own good, just to spare you the stress of dealing with the numbers. A bitter laugh escaped my lips. It was a dry, joyless sound that bounced off the walls of my bedroom. So that was the little narrative my daughter was building. I wasn't just an ignorant old farm woman anymore. Now I was a senile lady who needed to be rescued from her own incompetence. My memory is absolutely perfect, Thomas. It is so perfect that I remember exactly what Arthur and I signed in your office back in the winter of 2012. Emily brought an investor to the farm today. Some man in a flashy suit who wants to build an eco-resort and completely bulldoze the Walnut Grove. I heard her talking to him out on the porch. She has an irrevocable general power of attorney already drafted up. She is going to present it to me next week, completely disguised as some routine county paperwork. She wants me to sign over total rights to the land. I heard Thomas curse under his breath. It was one of the very few times in 3 decades that I had ever heard the man use a bad word. That is an outrage. That is absolute villainy, the lawyer muttered, pure indignation vibrating through the receiver. Margaret, do not sign anything. Absolutely nothing. If she puts a piece of paper in front of you, tell her you want to read it over with me first. With that kind of power, she can sell the land for pennies on the dollar and throw you right out on the street. Legally speaking, if you put your signature on that dotted line, our room to defend you later is practically zero. Do not worry, Thomas. I'm not going to sign her power of attorney, I said, staring right at my computer screen. But I am also not going to just sit around and wait for her to corner me. I want us to activate the dormant clause in the agricultural corporation. Today, right now. The silence on the other end of the line was long and incredibly heavy. Thomas was processing the massive weight of what I was asking. What Emily did not know, what absolutely no one in Chicago knew, was that Oak Creek Farm was not actually in my personal name. When Arthur started getting sick years ago and seeing how our daughter was drifting further and further away, entirely obsessed with fast money and city life, Thomas had suggested a protection strategy for us. We legally transferred the title of all our lands into a closed private corporation that we created ourselves. I was the owner of 99% of the shares, but inside the bylaws of that corporation, meticulously drafted by Thomas, we had included a fail-safe defense mechanism, a dormant clause that allowed me, with just my digital signature, to instantly transfer total administration and usage rights of the land into an agricultural conservation trust. In perpetuity, it would permanently block any possibility of sale, subdivision, or commercial hotel development. Margaret, if we pull the trigger on Document B and transfer the rights to the trust, the land becomes completely bulletproof. No one, not even you, will ever be able to sell a single square foot to an outside investor ever again. It will be legally locked exclusively for traditional agricultural use. This is a completely irreversible decision. This land is not for sale, Thomas. Not today, not tomorrow, and not when I am buried 6 feet under it. Arthur left his entire life out in those furrows. If Emily wants money, she can go out and work for it. But she is absolutely not going to use her father's bones to pay for her luxuries. Get the digital document ready. Send it to me through the secure portal. I'm going to sign it right now using my cryptographic token. Understood, Margaret, Thomas said, his voice regaining its sharp professional firmness, tinged now with a deep sense of respect. Give me 20 minutes to generate the filing, link it to the trust registry, and send you the encrypted link. Have your USB device handy. And, Margaret? Yes, Thomas. Arthur would be incredibly proud of you. He always knew you were the strongest out of the two of you. Thank you, Thomas. I will be waiting for the email. I ended the call. I set the phone down on the desk and stood up from the chair. I walked over to my bedroom window and pulled back the heavy curtain just a fraction of an inch. From there, I had a crystal-clear view of the west side of the farm, right where the land sloped gently down toward the creek. Far off in the distance, I saw 2 figures walking among the trees. It was Emily and Mr. Vance. He was walking and gesturing wildly, pointing with both hands at the wide open space, no doubt picturing luxury cabins with giant glass windows right where our cattle were currently grazing. She was walking right beside him, nodding along, laughing in that fake, overly accommodating way she had picked up in the city. The pain tried to rear its head again, a sharp sting right in the back of my throat, watching her walk all over the very dirt she was born on, selling it off with every single step she took. But I swallowed it down. I picked up my phone again. I needed to secure the perimeter. I dialed Hank's number. Hank was the farm foreman, a 60-year-old man with skin as tough as old leather and hands as rough as sandpaper. He had worked alongside Arthur since they were both young boys. He lived in the small caretaker's cabin right near the main entrance, and he knew every single rock, every ditch, and every piece of barbed wire on our land. He did not have any fancy college degrees or expensive suits, but his loyalty to this farm ran far deeper than any printed contract ever could. "Boss?" Hank answered on the very first ring. In the background, I could hear the loud churning of the main water pump motor. "Hank, shut the pump off for a minute and listen to me very carefully," I said. My voice left absolutely no room for debate. The roar of the motor died down almost instantly. "Go ahead, Miss Margaret. I am right here." The guest Emily brought with her. The man in the suit. They are walking down toward the creek right by the old walnut trees. I do not want them crossing past the stone fence. And under no circumstances are you to let that man bring a tape measure, a drone, or any kind of surveying equipment onto our soil. If they ask, you tell them the wooden bridge is rotted out and it is completely unsafe to cross. And Hank? Yes, ma'am. Padlock the gates to the north pasture and let the big dogs loose in that sector. Have them patrol the area. No one goes inside the barns. No one inspects the tractors. Today the farm is on lockdown. I heard Hank let out a deep, heavy breath. It was the sound of absolute, complete understanding. He did not need long-winded explanations. He had watched Emily grow up. He had seen the quiet disdain she held for us over the last few years. Hank knew exactly what was going on just from hearing the sharp edge in my voice. Understood, Miss Margaret. They do not cross the stone fence. And I will turn the dogs loose up north right this second. You just rest easy. We take care of our own around here. Thank you, Hank. I hung up. I looked back out the window. Sure enough, a couple of minutes later, I saw Hank's broad, hunched figure emerge from the fruit trees. He walked directly toward where Emily and Mr. Vance were standing, intercepting them right before they could reach the walnut grove. I could not hear what he told them, but I saw Mr. Vance stop dead in his tracks, visibly annoyed, and I saw Emily cross her arms in total frustration. Hank just stood planted right there, unmovable. A human barrier made of dirt and loyalty that city money simply could not cross. I turned back around to head toward the computer, but a sound stopped me in my tracks. Light footsteps out in the hardwood hallway. The unmistakable creak of the loose floorboard right outside my bedroom door. Emily had come back inside the house. A few seconds later, 3 soft knocks tapped against the solid wood of my door. "Mom, are you in there?" My daughter's voice sounded muffled, putting on that sweet, childish tone she used to use back when she was a teenager, asking me for money to go out with her friends. I did not answer right away. I walked silently up to the door. My breathing was completely calm. My pulse was beating like a Swiss watch. I twisted the brass latch with a swift motion and swung the door wide open before she even had time to step back. Emily was standing right in the doorway, a tight, forced smile painted onto her lips. Her eyes quickly scanned my face. She was looking for any trace of tears, looking for the fragile, offended old woman she fully expected to find. She found absolutely none of that. My face was a mask of pure, absolute neutrality. "Mom, you really scared me walking off the porch like that," she said, taking a step forward and trying to touch my arm. I moved back just a fraction of an inch, just enough so that her hand was left hovering in empty air before she awkwardly let it drop. Mr. Vance felt a little bit uncomfortable. "He thought maybe you didn't want to host us. I told him you were probably just exhausted from the heat. You know how you get around this time of the afternoon when it gets too hot." "The heat does not exhaust me, Emily. I have spent 40 years working under this sun," I replied, my voice totally flat, completely stripped of any emotional inflection. "I came inside to get a pill for a headache. Nothing more." Emily looked visibly relieved. Her posture relaxed. Her shoulders dropped slightly, and that predatory smile crept right back into the corners of her mouth. "Oh, poor Mom. It's just that you work way too hard. That is exactly why I am always telling you that you need to rest. Stop worrying about so many things." She leaned casually against the doorframe, crossing her ankles with that practiced, effortless elegance she had perfected. The smell of her imported perfume, sweet and sickly, tried to invade my bedroom, but it crashed right against the scent of beeswax and old wood that always governed my space. "Speaking of which, Mom," she started, her tone getting much more casual, entirely too rehearsed. "Next week I am going to come by with a friend from the office, a lawyer." I stared her dead in the eyes. I didn't even blink. "A lawyer? What on earth do we need a lawyer at the farm for, Emily? Things are perfectly in order here. Your father did not leave any debts behind." No, it's nothing about debts, Mom. Just relax," she rushed to say, raising a hand as if she were trying to calm down a spooked animal. "It's just boring stuff. It's a mandatory county procedure to update the agricultural taxes. You know how the government is, always inventing some new form just to squeeze money out of us. If we don't file it, they could hit us with a massive fine. The exact same words. The exact same rehearsed script she had recited to Mr. Vance out on the porch. My chest tightened, but I kept my expression completely blank. Ah, a mandatory procedure. I repeated the words slowly, tasting the lie hanging right there in the air. I do not understand those modern things anymore, sweetheart. So many papers, so many signatures. It makes me dizzy. Emily's eyes sparkled with an absolute flash of triumph. She had heard exactly what she wanted to hear, the full confirmation of my weakness, the absolute proof that her plan was completely flawless. Exactly, Mom. Don't break your head trying to figure it all out. It's just confusing legal jargon. Pure bureaucracy. I will handle everything. You just have to sign exactly where the lawyer tells you to, and that's it. I will take on all the responsibility. I am lifting that heavy weight right off your shoulders. That way, you can just dedicate yourself to your little plants and get some rest. Does that sound good to you? The deep cynicism of her words was so incredibly thick, you could practically reach out and touch it. She was literally asking me to hand her the exact weapon she was going to use to execute me. And she was asking for it with the sweetest smile of a loving daughter. That sounds perfect, Emily, I said, maintaining dead eye contact. Bring the papers next week. I am going to sign exactly what needs to be signed. That is great, Mom, she exclaimed, giving the doorframe a soft, cheerful pat. You are going to see. It is going to take a huge weight right off your shoulders. Anyway, I will let you get some rest. I'm going to go see if Hank will actually let us pass down to the creek. He was being a little bit stubborn out there. She spun around and started walking back down the hallway. Her high heels echoed like loud hammer strikes against the wooden floorboards. She didn't say goodbye again. She already had exactly what she wanted. She'd already discarded me. I watched her disappear at the very end of the hallway, right into the bright light of the porch. I closed my bedroom door. I turned the brass latch once again. Click. The silence rushed back in, but this time it was an electric kind of silence. I walked back over to the oak desk. I sat down in front of the laptop. A small envelope icon was flashing in the bottom corner of the screen. Thomas Mitchell was a man of his word. The email had arrived. I opened the message. The subject line read, Document B, Oak Creek Trust Activation, Urgent. I plugged the small black USB device, my encrypted digital signature token, right into the side port of the computer. The red light on the device flashed on, waiting for my command. I clicked the secure link attached to the email. The legal document unfolded across the screen. It was 10 pages of absolutely flawless legal jargon. A heavy steel padlock forged entirely out of words that Thomas had prepared years ago for this exact moment. The irrevocable clause. The total transfer of commercial exploitation rights over to the Agricultural Conservation Trust. Once signed, not me, not Emily, not any shiny-suited investor could ever alter the destiny of this land. It would remain farmland, sowing and harvesting until the very end of time. I scrolled the cursor all the way down to the bottom of the last page. There was a bright blue box that read, Insert digital signature. I thought about Arthur. I thought about his hands, cracked and bleeding from the freezing cold. About his back, permanently hunched over under the crushing weight of heavy seed bags. I thought about the very first time we ever saw the green leaves sprouting from the young walnut trees. And then I thought about Emily laughing out on the porch, calling me old, calling me useless, plotting out the paperwork to strip us of everything we had built. I clicked on the blue box. The system prompted me for the security pin for my cryptographic device. I placed my fingers, those swollen, arthritic fingers that were supposedly only good for baking cakes, hovering over the keyboard. I entered the 8 numbers with lethal precision. I pressed the Enter key. The screen froze for a split second, processing. And then, a glowing green seal appeared stamped across the document, accompanied by a bold message right in the center of the screen. Signature validated. Document successfully registered and submitted to the state registry. Irreversible operation. I leaned back against the wooden chair. Outside, Emily was still trying to convince Hank to let her cross down to the creek, fully believing that the very dirt she was standing on already belonged to her. She didn't have the slightest clue that, with one single click in the dead silence of my bedroom, I had just turned her massive $1 million empire into a pile of dust blowing in the wind. It was entirely done. And now, all that was left to do was sit back and let her bring her own rope next week. The bright green seal remained on the computer screen for several minutes, softly blinking with the system's final confirmation. The word irreversible stared right back at me from the dead center of the digital document. It was firm, completely unmovable, carved into the code of the state registry with the exact same strength that Arthur had used to carve our initials into the trunk of the old oak tree in the backyard. The hum of the machine's fan was the only sound left in the room. I did not feel relief. I did not feel triumph. I did not feel joy. I just felt the cold, absolute weight of a heavy iron door slamming shut forever. I had saved the land, but in doing so, I had finally accepted the fact that the daughter I remembered, that little girl with the scraped knees, simply did not exist anymore. I reached my hand toward the side of the computer and pulled out the small USB device. The red light died instantly. The secure link to the government portal was severed. I closed the lid of the machine with a slow, deliberate motion, listening to the soft creak of the plastic hinges. I held the cold black token between my arthritic fingers and walked over to the cherrywood dresser, sitting next to the mirror. I opened the top drawer, the one where I kept my linen handkerchiefs and the few pieces of jewelry I never bothered to wear. Way in the back, hidden underneath a fine wool shawl, there was a small carved wooden box that Arthur had given me for our very first anniversary. Resting inside was his old pocket watch. It had been permanently stopped at 3:15 ever since the exact day his heart failed. I placed the USB device right next to the watch, metal clinking against metal. Frozen time resting right beside the exact tool that had just secured our entire future. I closed the little box. I shut the drawer. I looked at myself in the mirror for just a second. My gray hair was perfectly pulled back. My blouse was buttoned all the way up to the collar. There were absolutely no tears in my eyes. There was no trembling in my hands. The pathetic weakness that Emily was so desperately hoping to exploit simply did not live inside this body. I turned around. I walked over to the door and twisted the brass latch. The click echoed loudly into the silent hallway. I stepped out of the bedroom and walked right back out toward the front porch. The sun had already begun its descent behind the jagged ridgeline of the hills, staining the sky a furious, violent orange that promised even more brutal heat for the days to come. The air had finally lost a bit of its crushing weight, and a dry breeze was just starting to rustle through the oak leaves. I pushed the double doors open and stepped back out onto the porch. The green porcelain cups were still sitting on the iron table, holding the dark, cold remains of coffee at the bottom. The slices of lemon cake were completely untouched. Far off in the distance, walking up the dirt path from the creek, I saw Emily and Mr. Vance coming into view. They were walking fast, but not with the light, easy steps of a countryside stroll. They were marching with the heavy, clumsy strides of two people who were deeply, incredibly frustrated. Mr. Vance was walking a few paces ahead. His impeccably tailored gray suit did not look quite so perfect anymore. The cuffs of his pants were caked in a fine layer of yellowish dust, and one of his expensive leather shoes had a dark smear of dried mud right on the toe. He was wiping a white cloth handkerchief across his sweating forehead, muttering angry things that the wind wouldn't let me hear. Emily was practically jogging behind him, struggling to keep her balance in those high heels on the uneven dirt. Her arms were tightly crossed, and her face was twisted into a scowl of absolute disgust. When they finally saw me standing out on the porch, right next to the coffee table, Mr. Vance stopped in his tracks for a second. He adjusted an invisible knot at his collar and forced a tight, rigid smile that never quite reached his eyes. I stood completely still, my hands crossed in front of my apron, just waiting for them. "Mrs. Margaret?" Mr. Vance said as he reached the bottom of the wooden porch steps, breathing rather heavily. "What an incredibly challenging piece of terrain you have down there. Your foreman is a very peculiar man. Very, very protective of his work, it seems." "Hank knows his trade, Mr. Vance. This land is not a public park for a casual stroll. There are old ditches and treacherous roots. He is just making sure nobody gets hurt," I replied. My voice sounded entirely flat and serene, without a single trace of an apology. Emily stomped up the wooden steps, digging her sharp heels hard into the wood. She stopped right next to me, breathing heavily, and glared at me with a nasty mix of annoyance and deep condescension. "Mom, that old man is completely out of his mind. He let the dogs loose on us up in the north pasture, and he planted himself right in the middle of the creek trail telling us the bridge was rotted out. They almost bit a hole straight through Vance's pants. We are going to have to force him into retirement soon. He is way too old to be walking around deciding who gets to pass and who doesn't on our own property." Our own property. The casual ease with which she threw around that plural pronoun tied a metallic knot right in my stomach. This was the exact same property she was planning to rip out from under me with a piece of paper rigged with legal traps. "Hank is going to retire when his two legs can no longer hold him up, Emily. In the meantime, he is the man who watches the gates." I said it while staring directly into my daughter's dark eyes. I didn't lower my gaze. I didn't soften my tone. For one tiny split second, I saw a shadow of genuine doubt flash across Emily's face, a spark of total confusion in the face of my firmness. She was so incredibly used to my submissive silence and my soft, gentle nodding. But the sheer arrogance of the city quickly covered her right back up. She shook her head, dismissing my words completely with a dismissive wave of her hand. "Whatever you say, Mom. We are not going to stand here and argue about the staff right now. Vance needs to get back to Chicago before it gets dark. He has a very important dinner meeting with some other investors." Mr. Vance was already halfway to the massive black vehicle. He pulled the driver's side door open and turned back to face us, giving a brief, tight nod. "It has been a very enlightening afternoon, Mrs. Margaret. This place has enormous potential. Simply enormous. We will speak again soon. Excuse me." He slid into the driver's seat and slammed the heavy door shut with a dull thud. Emily stepped closer to me and planted a quick, dry kiss on my cheek. The smell of her sweet perfume mixed heavily with the sharp scent of cold sweat and utter frustration. "I will see you next week, Mom. Remember what we talked about. I am bringing my lawyer friend out here so we can finally sign those county papers. Make sure you don't forget to have your ID handy, okay? It's a really quick procedure. It won't take up more than 10 minutes of your time." "I will be right here waiting for you, Emily." "With the papers right on the table," I replied. She smiled, deeply satisfied. She honestly believed my confirmation was the final surrender of an exhausted old woman. She turned around, walked carefully down the wooden steps, and climbed into the passenger seat of the black vehicle. The massive engine roared to life, kicking up a thick cloud of golden dust off the gravel. The dark car disappeared down the pathway lined with hydrangeas, fading out of sight toward the main highway. I stood completely still on the porch, just watching the dust slowly settle back down onto the green leaves. The heavy, absolute silence returned to the farm. I heard the rough crunch of heavy work boots approaching from the side of the house. Hank came walking around the corner, holding his straw hat in his hands, his weathered face covered in dirt. He stopped right at the bottom of the porch steps, staring off in the exact direction the car had just vanished. "They are gone, boss," he said, his voice raspy and measured. "They are gone, Hank. You did a damn good job." What exactly were they looking at down there? Hank spat off to the side, right into the dry dirt, a gesture of pure disgust that the man rarely ever used. The guy in the suit was pacing out the distance between the old walnut trees and the riverbed. He was telling little Emily that they could fit at least 10 large wooden platforms right there. He said they were going to have to clear-cut the entire western tree line just to get an unobstructed view of the mountains, and little Emily was just nodding along to everything, telling him it was no problem at all, that those trees were too old anyway and hardly produced any nuts anymore. I felt the blood pounding fiercely in my temples. The walnut trees on the west side, the exact same trees that Arthur and I had planted by hand during the absolute worst drought of the 1980s. I clearly remembered my husband hauling heavy iron buckets of water all the way from the well at 3 a.m, his hands cracked and bleeding from the bitter cold, just so those little seedlings wouldn't die. I remembered how we sat down right in the mud, holding each other, entirely exhausted, the morning we finally saw the very first green sprout survive the winter freeze. Those trees were not just old wood, they were the flesh and blood of our history. And my own daughter was perfectly willing to chop them up into lumber for some stranger's balcony. I turned my head and looked over at the old wooden barn, the exact same barn that Emily had pointed at with such deep disgust when she first arrived. The double doors were cracked open, revealing the dark shadows inside. Right in the dead center of that barn, there was a completely empty space on the packed dirt floor, a perfect square where the soil was a much darker shade. It was the exact spot where the green John Deere tractor used to be parked. The memory ambushed me without asking for permission, sharp, vivid, and incredibly cruel. It was a freezing cold morning in March, almost 20 years ago. Emily had just turned 18. Her bags were fully packed, shiny canvas suitcases that clashed horribly against the worn-out walls of our farmhouse. She wanted to go to the most expensive, elite private college in Chicago. She wanted an apartment near downtown. She wanted brand new books. She wanted clothes that didn't constantly smell like firewood smoke. We did not have that kind of money sitting in the bank. Arthur had spent 2 entire nights sitting at the kitchen table, running numbers in a little black notebook, aggressively rubbing his bloodshot eyes until it almost bruised him. On the 3rd day, he finally picked up the phone and called a heavy machinery buyer from the next town over. I saw the entire scene projecting right there in the empty space of the barn. I saw the massive, heavy-set man counting out thick stacks of $100 bills right on the green hood of the tractor. I saw Arthur signing the bill of sale with a hand that was trembling slightly. That tractor was his absolute pride and joy. It was the one piece of equipment that saved him from weeks of agonizing back pain during planting season. When he finally handed over the keys, Arthur lowered his head and ran his heavily calloused hand along the cold metal one last time, silently saying goodbye to the machine that quite literally put food on our table. Emily was standing right over by the door, staring down at her wristwatch, completely impatient. She didn't even glance at the tractor. She didn't even look at her father's sunken, devastated face. When the buyer handed the thick envelope of cash over to Arthur, my husband walked straight over to his daughter and placed it directly into her hands. "This is for your future, baby girl. Study hard. Go be someone great," Arthur had told her, giving her a terribly sad yet incredibly hopeful smile. Emily had just grabbed the envelope, shoved it quickly into her purse, and said, "Thanks, Dad. It's about time I got out of this mud pit. Up in the city, I'm actually going to be somebody real." That day, Arthur stood dead still at the front gate of the farm, watching the bus pull away until it was nothing more than a tiny speck fading into the horizon. He never bought another new tractor. He went right back to plowing the fields with the rusty old machinery, the kind that jammed up every 2 hours, the kind that slowly destroyed the discs in his spine, year after grueling year, until his body simply gave out completely. He traded in his own physical health just to buy her a seat at the table, a seat next to the very same people who were now wearing tailored gray suits, trying to strip us bare. The grand future that Arthur had purchased with his own sweat was the exact same guillotine that was now hanging directly over my head. I clenched my fists tight against my apron until my knuckles turned stark white. The sadness I had felt back in my bedroom evaporated completely, entirely consumed by a cold, silent fire. The Sentinel had taken absolute control. "Those trees do not get touched, Hank," I said, my voice slicing through the thick afternoon air like a razor-sharp knife. "Not the ones in the west, not the ones in the south, not a single branch. I know it, boss. They are going to have to bring a chainsaw over my dead body." "It will not have to come to that, Hank. They are not even going to have time to pull the ripcord." I turned around and started picking up the green porcelain cups off the table. I stacked them very carefully onto the heavy silver tray. The crystalline sound of the fine china clinking softly together seemed to finally clear the air. Hank just stood there at the bottom of the steps, waiting for instructions. He knew that whenever I started cleaning up, my head was actively drawing up battle lines. "Hank, listen to me very carefully. Next Tuesday, Emily is going to come back. She is going to bring a lawyer from the city." "Do you want me to lock the main gate, Miss Margaret? Do you want me to park the old pickup truck right across the road?" "No, quite the opposite. On Tuesday, I want you to open both sides of the large iron gate, the one at the main entrance. Leave them wide open from the early morning. I want them to find absolutely no barriers, not a single dog in their way. Let that black car drive right up to the front door of the house without ever having to hit the brakes. Let them come in perfectly comfortable, Hank. Let them believe they have a completely clear path." Hank stared at me. His small dark eyes, framed by deep wrinkles, narrowed slightly. He did not understand the exact tactic, but he understood my tone. He nodded slowly. "Whatever you say, boss. Open doors it is. Anything else?" "Yes. Tuesday at noon. I want you to put on a clean shirt and come up to the porch. You are going to stand right next to the hallway door, in complete silence. I just want you there, present. I want them to see that I am not alone in this house, even if they truly believe my signature is entirely worthless. I will be right there, standing as firm as a fence post, Miss Margaret. Do not worry about a thing." Hank put his hat back on, turned around, and walked toward the corral area. His figure slowly faded into the long shadows that were already covering half the yard. I picked up the heavy tray and went inside the house. I walked straight into the kitchen. I washed the green cups, the glass platter, and the little milk pitcher. I washed everything with boiling water and white soap, scrubbing hard, almost as if I could scrub the very breath of betrayal right off the porcelain. I dried each piece with a clean cloth and stored them on the absolute highest shelf of the dining room display cabinet. I shut the glass doors. Those cups would never see the light of day for Emily again, never again. The following days dragged by with the thick, slow pace of molasses. Time seemed to stretch out endlessly on the farm, but I did not sit still waiting for the heavy blow to land. I threw myself into physical labor with an intensity I had not demanded of myself in years. I needed to feel the dirt underneath my fingernails. I needed the dull ache in my back muscles at the end of the day to remind me exactly what it was I was defending. On Wednesday, I woke up long before dawn and went out to the backyard garden. I pruned the rose bushes, clipping away the dead branches with the large wooden-handled shears. Every single snap of the metal blade cutting through the dead wood was a firm decision made. On Thursday, I cleaned out the filters on the main water pump, sinking my bare hands straight into the freezing water and the dark mud of the canal. On Friday, I walked all the way down to the southern property line. I checked the barbed wire fence, foot by foot, making absolutely sure the heavy wooden posts were standing firm in their place. The farm spoke back to me in the crisp language of dry leaves and the tapping of woodpeckers. It told me it was alive, that it was resisting, and that it was absolutely not going to let itself be paved over for a stack of cash and a contract drafted up in the city. Emily did not call once the entire week. Her silence was completely calculated. She wanted to keep a low profile. She did not want to raise any suspicions, just letting the ignorant old woman keep watering her little plants in peace until the very moment she presented the fatal piece of paper. I did not call her either. The rugged black cell phone just sat on my desk, entirely mute and cold. I only picked it up on Saturday afternoon to send one short text message to Thomas Mitchell. "Everything is ready on my end. I will see you on Tuesday." A low, heavy ceiling of gray clouds covered the valley, trapping the heat and making the air feel thick and incredibly hard to breathe. It was the typical weather right before a massive summer storm, the kind that makes the window panes rattle in their frames. I got out of bed at 6 in the morning. I did not put on my cooking apron. I did not beat any eggs with sugar. I did not zest any lemons. The large oven remained completely shut off and stone cold. I walked over to the closet and pulled out a dark, heavy dress. It was the one I used to wear to church on highly important Sundays. I buttoned it up very carefully. I brushed my hair in front of the mirror and tied it back into a tight bun at the nape of my neck, securing it with metal bobby pins so that not a single gray strand was left loose. I put on my lace-up shoes, the heavy, closed-toe ones that make a loud, firm noise when you walk across hardwood. I looked at myself in the mirror. I was no longer a mother waiting for a sweet visit. I was the absolute owner of Oak Creek Farm. I stepped out of my bedroom and walked straight into the main dining room. It was a massive space, located right in the dead center of the house, with tall windows looking out onto the side porch. Right in the middle, completely dominating the room, sat a rectangular table made of solid oak. It was incredibly long and heavy, surrounded by 8 high-backed chairs. That was the table where Arthur and I used to sit and review the accounting ledgers on those freezing winter nights. It was a table meant for hard work, not for throwing celebrations. I grabbed a cotton cloth and polished the surface of the wood until I could see my own dark reflection staring right back at me. I did not put down a tablecloth. I did not set out any flower vases. I walked into the kitchen, grabbed a clear glass pitcher, filled it with ice-cold filtered water, and placed it exactly in the dead center of the oak table. Right next to it, I set out 4 plain, smooth glass tumblers. No fancy decorations, just completely ordinary cups. That was absolutely all they were going to get from me this time. Clear, cold water. I walked over to the head of the table, the chair that kept its back to the hallway and faced directly toward the front door. I sat down. The firm wood of the backrest supported my spine perfectly. I placed my hands, with their short, clean nails, flat against the solid oak surface. The house was completely silent. The grandfather clock in the corner of the dining room ticked away the seconds with a steady metallic rhythm. Tick, tock, tick, tock. At 10:30 in the morning, I heard the dogs barking off in the distance, down near the main gates. They were not attack barks. It was simply a warning that something had crossed the property line. Hank had kept his word. The iron gates were wide open. 5 minutes later, the unmistakable crunch of thick tires crushing the gravel driveway shattered the quietness of the house. The black car rolled forward slowly, incredibly sure of itself. It glided down the very path my husband's sweat had built, creeping closer to the front door without meeting a single ounce of resistance. The engine cut out. I heard the heavy thud of the car doors slamming shut. I heard footsteps walking up onto the porch. I heard Emily's high-pitched voice giving some sort of instruction in a hushed tone. I did not move. I kept my hands planted flat against the table. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the smell of furniture wax and old wood, feeling the block of ice inside my chest solidify completely. The trap was fully set. The net was pulled tight, and the guests had just stepped over the threshold. Now all I had to do was let them talk. The loud creak of the front door hinges broke the silence of the house with the sudden violence of a thunderclap. I still did not move. I kept my hands resting on the cold surface of the oak table, feeling every single grain of the wood right beneath my fingertips. Footsteps echoed through the entryway. First came the sharp, rapid clicking of Emily's high heels. They were anxious, beating out a fast rhythm of total urgency. Right behind her came a much heavier, firmer step. It was the unmistakable sound of hard-soled, expensive leather shoes, stepping onto the floors of my house as if they were already walking on fully conquered territory. "Mom!" Emily called out from the hallway. Her voice bounced off the high walls, filled with that plastic rehearsed joy that completely turned my stomach. "We are here! Wow, it is so dark in here. It feels like it is the middle of the night." She appeared right in the doorway of the dining room. She was wearing a fitted navy blue silk dress. It was absolutely spotless, without a single wrinkle despite the long drive from Chicago. Her brown hair fell perfectly straightened over her shoulders. Right behind her emerged the lawyer. He was a young man, no older than 35, with his hair slicked back and a custom-tailored dark blue suit that absolutely screamed fast money and pure arrogance. He carried a black leather briefcase in one hand and his cell phone in the other. His eyes quickly scanned the dining room. He was immediately evaluating the antique furniture, the heavy curtains, and the wrought iron chandelier hanging from the ceiling. His gaze held no appreciation whatsoever for the history of the place. He was simply appraising antiques. "It is to keep the cool morning air trapped inside, Emily," I replied. My voice sounded completely flat, totally devoid of any emotion. "The heat today is going to be brutal. Come on in, have a seat." Emily walked toward the table, followed closely by the man. She chose the chair directly to my right. He made himself comfortable on my left, dropping his heavy briefcase onto the table with a sharp, dry thud. The oak wood, which had endured decades of hard work, family dinners, and heavy tears, received the lawyer's black leather as a completely silent offense. "Mom, I want to introduce you to Mr. Hayes," Emily said, gesturing to the man with a smile that completely failed to hide the tight tension in her jaw. "He is one of the partners at the law firm that advises our company. He is a top-tier professional. He cleared a spot in his busy schedule just to come all the way out here and help us deal with this tedious paperwork." Mr. Hayes reached out a hand with perfectly manicured fingernails. His smile was incredibly sharp. It was the kind of smile rehearsed in front of a bathroom mirror specifically to project pure confidence and superiority. "Mrs. Margaret, it is an absolute pleasure to finally meet you," he said, his voice deep and smooth as velvet. "Your daughter has told me absolute wonders about you and about this beautiful property. It is a very picturesque place, incredibly rustic. I completely understand why it is so difficult for you to deal with modern bureaucracy from way out here, but that is exactly what we are here for." I did not shake his hand. Instead, I picked up the clear glass pitcher sitting in the center of the table and began pouring water into the plain glasses. The crisp sound of the ice-cold water hitting the glass filled the quiet dining room. Mr. Hayes slowly pulled his hand back. He tried to act like the snub didn't bother him at all, but I saw a tiny muscle twitching hard in his jaw. "I'm not serving coffee today," I said, sliding one glass over to Emily and another over to him. "It is entirely too hot for warm drinks. Clear water is much better. It cools you down and it does not hide a single thing." Emily let out a highly nervous little laugh, picking up the glass without taking a sip. "Oh, Mom, always so set in your ways," she muttered. She glanced at me out of the corner of her eye, searching my face for any sign of resistance, but she only found the exact same mask of stone I had maintained all week long. "Well, just like I told you on the phone, we really do not want to take up too much of your time. We know you have your daily routines, your little plants to water, and all those things. Mr. Hayes brought the county forms with him. The young lawyer nodded, acting as if he had just been given his grand cue to start the performance. He popped open the metal clasps on his briefcase. The sound was a sharp, loud crack in the perfectly silent room. He pulled out a thick, dark blue cardboard folder and placed it right onto the table. He opened it up with calculated slowness, revealing a thick stack of white pages. They were covered top to bottom in dense paragraphs and tiny print. Mrs. Margaret, I am going to be very brief so I don't bore you with all the technical terminology that, quite frankly, no one is actually interested in, Hayes began. He interlaced his fingers on the table and looked at me with a level of pure condescension that made my blood boil. The county government has completely updated the tax matrix for rural properties over 100 acres. If you do not submit an ownership update declaration by this Friday, the farm is going to fall into a retroactive penalty category. We are talking about financial figures that could severely compromise the entire viability of your upcoming harvests. I kept my gaze locked dead on his eyes. I did not blink. I did not nod. I just let his blatant lies float right there in the thick air of the dining room. Emily, being such a devoted daughter and deeply concerned for your well-being, asked me to personally draft up this document. The lawyer continued, sliding the thick stack of papers across the surface of the oak table until they rested right in front of me. It is simply a management delegation. Basically, you sign right here, and we completely take care of fighting with the county. We pay the stamp duties, and we make absolutely sure you avoid those massive fines. You do not lose a single thing. On the contrary, you gain total peace of mind. You will never have to think about numbers or government offices ever again. Emily leaned forward, resting her hand softly on my arm. Her touch was completely freezing. This is for your own good, Mom. You have worked way too hard in your life already. Dad would not have wanted you to spend your final years totally stressed out over taxes and paperwork you don't even understand. Just let me take care of you now. Let me shoulder the responsibility. You just need to put your signature down on the very last page. Then we will get out of your hair and let you rest. I looked down at the document. The very first page did not have any county government letterhead on it at all. It had the shiny logo of Mr. Hayes's corporate law firm. My eyes, which had spent thousands of long nights reading the absolute finest print on fertilizer contracts and bulk grain sales, rapidly scanned the first visible paragraph. Right there, perfectly hidden in an ocean of completely useless legal jargon, were the magic keywords: irrevocable special power of attorney, full faculties of disposition, alienation of real estate assets, without any obligation to render accounts. It was exactly what Thomas had warned me about. This was not a tax procedure. It was my financial death sentence. It was the complete total sale of Oak Creek Farm, heavily disguised as a sweet favor from a loving daughter. I raised my right hand and pressed my palm flat against the document. I felt the texture of the thick paper. It was still warm from being trapped inside the leather briefcase. "This is an awful lot of pages for a simple tax update, Mr. Hayes," I said. My voice sounded incredibly steady, echoing off the high walls of the dining room. My husband and I paid the taxes on this exact dirt for 40 straight years. They never once asked us to sign a packet this thick. The lawyer exchanged a lightning-fast look with Emily, a look that only lasted a fraction of a second, but it was absolutely loaded with intense irritation. He honestly thought I was just a 5-minute pit stop, just some clueless old woman who would blindly sign anything in front of her just so she could get back to tending her garden. "Laws change, Mrs. Margaret," Hayes replied. He forced that sharp smile once again, though this time it didn't even come close to reaching his eyes. "Bureaucracy has become much more complex these days. What you have sitting right there under your hand is a comprehensive mandate of representation. It perfectly covers absolutely all possible contingencies, just so we never have to come back and bother you with this again in the future. It is standard procedure. Standard procedure, I repeated very slowly, as if I were deliberately tasting the words just to see if they were laced with poison. And if I put my signature on that final page, exactly like my daughter says, does this land still belong to me, or am I signing over something else? Emily yanked her hand back off my arm as if she had just touched a hot stove. Her posture went entirely rigid. Of course it still belongs to you, Mom. What kind of crazy things are you saying? Emily jumped in, her voice jumping up an octave, completely tainted with fabricated, dramatic outrage. Do you actually think I would make you sign something bad? It honestly offends me that you would even doubt me. I brought one of the absolute best corporate lawyers in Chicago all the way down here just to save you from a massive headache. And here you are interrogating us like you are some kind of auditor. You do not need to understand every single word on that paper. That is exactly what he is here for. I read what I sign, Emily. I always have, I replied, without ever raising my voice. Mr. Hayes let out a short, incredibly heavy sigh. He pulled a heavy silver fountain pen from the inside pocket of his suit jacket. He uncapped it with one fluid, practiced motion and set it down on the table, right next to the deadly document. Mrs. Margaret, with all due respect, time is really of the essence here. I have important court hearings back in the city this afternoon. I give you my absolute word, as a sworn legal professional, that this document is strictly for the management of your assets in front of the tax collection entities. There is absolutely nothing shady going on here. Your daughter loves you deeply, and she only wants to protect you from your own administrative fatigue. Just sign right here on the dotted line, and we will take care of all the rest. At that precise instant, I heard the deep, rhythmic thud of heavy work boots approaching down the hallway. Hank appeared right in the doorway of the dining room. He was wearing his clean button-down shirt, tucked neatly into his dark canvas work pants. He held his straw hat respectfully between his thick, calloused hands. He didn't say a single word. He simply stood right there, completely filling the space with his broad, heavy presence. His eyes were locked dead on the city lawyer. Hayes spun around in his chair, visibly startled by the foreman's completely silent appearance. "What does this man want?" the lawyer asked. His voice lost quite a bit of its polished professional veneer, revealing a sharp note of genuine nervousness. "This is Hank, the farm foreman," I said, without moving my hand an inch off the document. "He is here because in this house we never make major decisions behind closed doors. He is a witness to absolutely everything that happens on this land." Emily rolled her eyes hard, huffing with barely contained fury. "Mom, this is a completely private family matter. Tell your employee to go back out to the barns. He is interrupting us." "Hank stays exactly where he is," I replied. My tone sliced right through the air like an invisible whip. The grandfather clock in the corner of the dining room struck 11 in the morning, and right in the fading echo of that final metallic chime, the sound of a second engine cut right through the heavy morning air. It was not a smooth, silent engine like Emily's luxury black car. It was the loud, raspy, constant roar of a much older, much tougher vehicle, the kind that was entirely used to dirt roads and deep mud. Emily frowned deeply and whipped her head toward the window, desperately trying to see through the heavy curtains. "Were you expecting someone, Mom?" she asked. The very first note of true, undeniable alarm finally slipped into her voice. "Out here in the country, our doors are always wide open for old friends," I replied. We all listened as the engine cut out, then the loud slam of a heavy truck door. The footsteps walking up onto the porch sounded completely different. They were not rushed, anxious high heels. They were not polished dress shoes trying to tiptoe away from the dirt. They were the firm, slow, highly deliberate steps of a man who knew this house every bit as well as I did. Hank took one step to the side of the doorframe. He yielded the right of way with a slow nod of his head, absolutely loaded with deep respect. Thomas Mitchell stepped right into the dining room. He was wearing his trademark charcoal gray suit, flawlessly pressed despite the heavy humidity of the day. He carried his own leather briefcase, beautifully worn and weathered by decades of hard work. His white hair was combed straight back, and his face, deeply marked by a lifetime of reading binding documents and sealing people's fates, reflected the absolute, unshakable seriousness of a judge who was just about to hand down a final sentence. Mr. Hayes went completely pale. The sharp, arrogant smile vanished from his face as if someone had just ripped it right off. He recognized the veteran lawyer the very second he walked in. In the legal circles of our entire state, the signature of Thomas Mitchell carried far more weight than any fancy corporate stamp from a massive Chicago law firm. "Good morning, Margaret," Thomas said. His deep, booming voice completely filled the room. He walked straight up to the oak table and stopped right in front of me, entirely ignoring the other two people sitting there. I apologize for the delay. There was a fallen tree blocking the county road. "You are right on time, Thomas. Just like you always are," I replied, finally lifting my hand off the deadly document Emily had brought. Emily jumped out of her chair. She pushed the heavy oak seat backward with a violent, piercing screech that actually hurt the ears. Her face was flushed beet red, completely disfigured by the blind fury of seeing her perfect plan derailed. "What is this man doing here, Mom?" she screamed, pointing a trembling finger right at Thomas. "I specifically told you I was bringing Mr. Hayes to handle the county issue. We absolutely do not need your small-town country lawyer sticking his nose where it does not belong. This is a matter regarding Dad's company." Thomas slowly turned his head and locked his eyes onto Emily. His gray eyes were as freezing cold as ice on a January morning. "Arthur did not leave behind a company, Emily. He left behind a working farm. And your mother specifically requested that I be present here today to review any document that you or your advisor—" Thomas glared at the young city lawyer with profound, unmistakable disgust. "Might attempt to put in front of her." Hayes cleared his throat loudly, desperately trying to regain some semblance of control over the room. He stood up, buttoning his suit jacket with a highly nervous twitch. He was trying to project an authority that had already completely slipped right through his manicured fingers. "Mr. Mitchell, this is a true honor. I am very familiar with your long track record," Hayes said. His tone was now overly sweet and incredibly defensive. "But your presence here today is completely unnecessary. This is merely a simple tax management mandate that Mrs. Margaret was just about to sign entirely on her own free will. It is a very minor administrative issue." Thomas did not even dignify him with a verbal response. He simply reached his hand out toward the oak table. "Allow me to see that management mandate, Margaret," he said. I slid the thick blue folder across the wood right into his waiting hands. Thomas pulled his reading glasses out of his jacket pocket. He put them on with agonizing slowness and finally began to read. The silence inside the dining room became absolute. It was completely crushing. The only sound in the entire house was the flipping of thick paper in the old lawyer's hands, and the rapid, panicked breathing coming from Emily. Hayes swallowed hard. The gulp was painfully audible. He was completely trapped, and he knew it. Thomas read the first page. He flipped to the second page. His experienced eyes rapidly scanned through the incredibly dense paragraphs. When he finally reached the third page, he let out a dry, hacking laugh. It was a sound completely stripped of any actual humor, a sound that echoed exactly like the sharp crack of a dead tree branch. "You are an incredibly bold man, Mr. Hayes," Thomas said. He lowered the heavy document and stared right at the young attorney over the rim of his glasses. "Or perhaps just incredibly foolish. A minor administrative issue, you say? What you have brought into this home is an irrevocable special power of attorney. It includes a full indemnity clause, the total assignment of all usufruct rights, and explicit unchecked faculties for the alienation, sale, or subdivision of cadastral parcel number 412, which is to say the entirety of Oak Creek Farm. Emily opened her mouth to scream something, but Thomas just raised one hand, stopping her dead in her tracks. If Margaret had actually signed this piece of paper, the old lawyer continued, his voice steadily rising in volume, vibrating with a fierce indignation that I could feel vibrating in my own bones. You, Emily, would have possessed the absolute legal authority to sell every single inch of this dirt to Mr. Vance tomorrow morning, and your mother would not have been able to do a single thing to stop you. You would have left her out on the street, stripped completely bare of her home, her livelihood, and the very memory of her husband. And you would have done it all protected by a document drafted in pure malice and presented to her under deliberate fraud. The blow landed perfectly. The naked, undeniable truth, thrown right onto the oak table, illuminated my daughter's horrific betrayal with a blinding, agonizing clarity. Emily looked at me. Her eyes no longer held any trace of that arrogant fury. Now they were filled with the wide, terrified panic of a cornered animal. "Mom, it is not like that. He doesn't understand. Mr. Vance was going to give us so much money, to both of us. You were going to be able to live like an absolute queen in the city. I just wanted what was best for you. Dad would have wanted us to move forward and progress." The excuse was so pathetic, so unbelievably hollow, that I didn't even bother feeling angry anymore. The block of ice sitting in my chest was perfectly, completely solid. I stood up slowly from my chair. I planted both of my hands flat on the table and leaned forward, staring directly into the eyes of the woman I had once carried in my own womb. "Do not ever use your father's name at this table, Emily," my voice said. It sounded deeper, much darker than I had heard it in years. "Your father literally broke his back to pay for your elite education. He sold his physical health just so you could hold a fancy degree, and you used that very same degree to bring a man in a shiny suit into my house, to sit him down on my porch, to plot exactly how you were going to rip out the walnut trees we planted with our own bare hands." "You do not know what you are talking about," Emily screamed. Hot tears of pure frustration were welling up in her eyes. She was losing her composure entirely. "You do not understand how the real world works anymore, Mom. This land is absolutely worthless if you do not exploit it. Mr. Vance was going to put down millions of dollars. And you just ruined everything because you are so incredibly stubborn and ignorant." I just let her frantic screams bounce right off the walls. I let her ugly contempt fill the entire room. And then, with absolute, unshakable calm, with the deadly precision of a surgeon sinking in a scalpel, I struck right back. "You are completely right, Emily," I said. My voice was soft, but it carried the crushing weight of an avalanche. "This land will be yours very soon, won't it? After all, the old woman doesn't understand business anymore, nor does she know what she's standing on. She just lives in the past, watering her little plants and dusting furniture." Emily's face completely froze. Every ounce of color drained rapidly from her cheeks, leaving her a sickly, ghost-like white. Her eyes widened to the point of tearing as my words, her very own words, the ones she had spoken out on the porch, fully believing I was out of earshot, stabbed her right in the throat. She took a terrified step backward, tripping hard over the heavy leg of her oak chair. "Did you honestly think I was deaf, Emily?" I continued, slowly walking around the edge of the large table, stepping closer to her, while Mr. Hayes instinctively backed away into the corner. "Did you actually believe that just because I wear dark dresses and need my own bread, I don't know how to lock a digital padlock?" I snapped my head toward the young lawyer. He was frantically trying to shove his thick stack of papers back into his leather briefcase. "Mr. Hayes," I said, stopping his trembling hands, with nothing but the sheer tone of my voice, "since you have your cell phone right there in your hand, and since you are such an incredibly diligent legal professional, I strongly suggest you log into the state registry portal. Right now. I want you to pull up the exact title status for Oak Creek Farm." The lawyer stared at me. He was totally confused, but sheer terror was visibly pulsing in the veins of his neck. He looked over at Thomas, who just nodded very slowly, confirming my direct order. With heavily trembling hands, Hayes unlocked his phone. His manicured fingers tapped frantically across the glowing screen. The dining room was plunged right back into a suffocating silence. It was interrupted only by the steady ticking of the grandfather clock and Emily's ragged, terrified breathing. A few agonizing seconds later, the lawyer's face completely transformed. His eyes scanned the screen of his phone, dropping down line after line after line. His mouth fell slightly open in an expression of absolute, total disbelief. "This cannot be right," Hayes whispered. His smooth voice was cracking hard. This is completely impossible. The system says—" "What exactly does the system say, counselor?" Thomas asked. He crossed his arms over his chest, heavily savoring the beautiful moment with all the patience of a wise old man. Hayes looked up from his glowing screen. He stared at Emily as if she were a literal ghost, and then he looked directly at me. His face held a bizarre mixture of sheer dread and absolute respect that I will never, ever forget. "The system indicates that the entire parcel was legally transferred 5 days ago. The commercial exploitation domain is permanently locked. Oak Creek Farm has been officially registered under an agricultural conservation trust. In perpetuity. It was digitally signed and executed by the majority shareholder of the owning corporation." The lawyer swallowed hard. Cold sweat was shining brightly on his forehead. "The land is entirely inalienable. It cannot be sold. It cannot be subdivided. You cannot build a single thing on this soil that is not strictly for agricultural use. The title is completely bulletproof." Emily let out a choked, horrifying sound, as if someone had just punched all the oxygen straight out of her lungs in one heavy blow. She desperately grabbed onto the edge of the oak table just to keep herself from collapsing to the floor. "What?" she babbled, staring at her lawyer in pure desperation. "What on earth are you talking about, Hayes? My mother does not own a private corporation. She doesn't even know how to use a digital signature. It has to be a glitch in the system." "It is not a glitch, Emily," the lawyer said. He snapped his leather briefcase shut with a harsh, violent snap. His polished arrogance was completely replaced by the sheer panic of a man who had just lost a multi-million-dollar client, a man who knew his elite law firm was about to look like an absolute joke in front of major Chicago investors. "The registry is completely irrevocable, and the cryptographic signature is fully validated. You completely wasted my time. You brought me all the way out here under entirely false premises. Mr. Vance is going to utterly destroy my professional reputation over this." Hayes grabbed his briefcase by the handle. He didn't even bother reaching back to pick up his expensive silver pen sitting right there on the oak table. He did not say goodbye. He brushed right past Hank, who slowly stepped to the side, leaving a clear path for the coward to run. We listened to the lawyer's rapid, incredibly clumsy footsteps fleeing down the hallway. We heard the heavy slam of the front door, and mere seconds later, the panicked roar of a car engine, gunning it in reverse down the gravel driveway. Emily was left completely alone, alone in front of me, in front of Thomas, in front of Hank. She stood completely alone in front of the very oak table where her father used to count spare coins just to buy her textbooks. I looked her up and down. I saw her expensive silk dress. I saw her designer high heels. I saw those perfectly manicured hands that had never once touched the very dirt that fed her. and I saw her massive empire of lies collapsed right there on the floor of my dining room. The old woman did understand business, Emily. I said it, my voice dropping down to a freezing whisper that cut through the room harder than any scream ever could. She understood exactly enough to know that the real thief never sneaks in through the window. The real thief walks right through the front door, smiling, and she calls you Mom. Emily sobbed. It was an ugly, broken sound entirely stripped of any remaining dignity. She tried to step closer to me, reaching out her trembling hands. Mom, please, do not do this to me. Vance is going to sue me for breach of contract. I had already signed a preliminary agreement with him. I put my own apartment up as collateral to pay for those massive land surveys. If I do not hand over this land, I lose absolutely everything. Mom, please, you can undo this. Just tell Thomas to undo it right now. I took one firm step backward, pulling completely out of her reach. I felt absolutely no pity. I felt zero compassion. I only felt the absolute, unshakable firmness of the Sentinel. The document is completely irreversible, Emily, just like what you did here today. I turned around, giving her my back. I looked over at Hank. He was still standing right by the door, unmovable as an old oak tree. Hank, I said. My voice rang out clear and incredibly strong across the room. Escort the lady to the exit, and the very second her car crosses the main boundary, pull the iron gates shut, lock them up with the heavy padlocks, and let the big dogs loose. Yes, boss, Hank replied. He took one heavy step toward Emily, pointing straight down the hallway with a firm sweep of his arm. Right this way, ma'am. Emily stood completely paralyzed for a second. She stared at my back, desperately waiting for that weak, sentimental mother to turn around, to hug her, to forgive her, to rescue her from her very own crippling greed. But I did not move an inch. I just stood there staring at the pitcher of clear water resting right in the center of the oak table. I listened to her footsteps dragging toward the exit. They were incredibly heavy, totally defeated. I listened to her muffled, broken crying slowly fading away down the long hallway, and finally, I heard the heavy, definitive slam of the front door swinging shut, sealing the farm, locking out the city, the greedy investors, and the woman who had once been my daughter. The summer storm was just about to explode outside, but inside the house, for the very first time in years, the air was entirely pure. The loud echo of the front door slamming vibrated against the glass of the dining room windows. It was a dry final sound that seemed to suck all the oxygen out of the room for just a second. I stood perfectly still at the head of the oak table, my gaze locked on the clear pitcher of water resting in the center. The water inside trembled slightly, capturing the faint vibrations of hurried footsteps retreating down the gravel path outside. I didn't move until I finally heard the roar of Emily's black car engine firing up. It was immediately followed by the harsh, violent crunch of tires skidding out, desperate to escape the very dirt she had just tried to steal. The silence that followed was completely different from the one that usually inhabited the farm. It was no longer the heavy silence of waiting. It wasn't the tense silence of things left unsaid. It was a clean, vast silence. It was the exact kind of quiet that settles over the fields right after a brutal hailstorm passes, and you step outside just to make sure the barn roofs are still in one piece. Thomas Mitchell let out a long, heavy sigh. It was a sound that seemed to carry the sheer exhaustion of all his years in the legal profession. He raised a hand to his face and pulled off his reading glasses, pinching the bridge of his nose tightly between his thumb and index finger. "She is gone," the old lawyer said. He lowered his hand and looked at me with an expression that mixed deep relief with profound sadness. It was the specific sadness of an old man who had just watched a family completely shatter forever. "She is gone, Thomas," I replied. My voice sounded strangely serene in the massive emptiness of the dining room. and she took her entire world of lies right out the door with her. At that precise moment, the sky, which had been threatening to crush us all morning beneath a low ceiling of gray clouds, finally broke wide open. A deafening clap of thunder rattled the hardwood floorboards right beneath our feet, and 1 second later, the rain began to fall. It was not a soft, gentle drizzle. It was a violent downpour, a thick, heavy curtain of water that hammered against the tin roof of the wraparound porch with the furious strength of 1,000 tiny hammers. The sharp smell of wet dirt, kicked up dust, and crushed oak leaves seeped right through the cracks in the windows. It flooded the house with the oldest, most comforting perfume I had ever known. I walked over to the table and picked up the pitcher of water. "Let's go into the kitchen, Thomas," I told him, turning my back entirely on the front door. "This dining room is far too cold for a rainy afternoon. I am going to make you a proper cup of hot tea, or some coffee, if you prefer. Plain ice water was only for guests who were never planning to stay." Thomas nodded. He picked up his worn leather briefcase with slow, measured movements. I led him down the hallway. The dark light of the storm plunged the house into shadows, but I did not bother turning on a single lamp. I knew the path perfectly by heart. I knew every knot in the wood. I knew every shadow cast by the heavy picture frames. When we reached the kitchen, the sound of the rain beating against the roof was even louder. It was a constant, incredibly comforting roar. I set the metal kettle down onto the gas stove. I struck a match, lit the burner, and pulled 2 thick ceramic mugs out of the everyday cupboard. Not the green porcelain cups. Those were already locked away inside their glass tomb forever. I pulled out the everyday mugs, the exact ones Arthur and I used to drink from during those freezing winter dawns. We sat down at the small pinewood table right next to the window. Outside, the water was pouring down in buckets. It was washing the yard. It was washing the dirt roads. It was completely erasing the tire tracks left by Emily's luxury car and the footprints of that lawyer's expensive shoes. "You did the right thing, Margaret," Thomas said suddenly, just as I was pouring the boiling water over the black tea leaves. "I know the pain is still there, even if you refuse to show it. She is your daughter. Nobody ever raises a child thinking that one day they will have to defend themselves against them using a binding legal contract. But if you had not triggered that trust, today you would be packing your entire life into cardboard boxes." I pushed the steaming mug across the table toward him. The thick vapor rose right up between us. "There is no pain left, Thomas. I felt the pain last week, right when I stood there and listened to her offer up my years and her own father's years, as if we were just a pile of useless junk sitting at a yard sale," I replied. I wrapped both of my hands around my own mug, feeling the intense heat of the ceramic soaking right into my arthritic knuckles. "What I feel right now is pure clarity. The land is entirely safe. The trees are staying exactly where they are, and that is absolutely the only thing that matters." Thomas took a slow sip of his hot tea and nodded, completely respecting my absolute refusal of pity. We sat there and talked for a while longer, but we didn't talk about Emily. We didn't talk about betrayals. We talked about the rising prices of grain seed. We talked about the rainfall projections for the upcoming month. We talked about the good old days, back when Arthur and he used to sit in this very same kitchen, arguing about local politics until they both completely lost their voices. When the heavy storm finally died down, reducing itself to a fine, persistent drizzle, Thomas put on his coat. He grabbed his worn briefcase and said his goodbyes right at the back door. I was left alone, truly alone, for the very first time since my husband had passed away, because before today, the ghost of hope, the hope that my daughter would actually come back, used to keep me company. Now, that hope was completely dead. It was buried 6 feet under the crushing weight of an irrevocable power of attorney that I never even signed. I walked back into the dining room to push in the heavy chairs. As I got closer to the oak table, a bright metallic flash caught my eye. It was Mr. Hayes's heavy silver fountain pen. In his frantic rush to escape, in his absolute panic upon realizing that his massive $1 million deal had just shattered against the solid wall of an old woman he deemed ignorant, he had completely forgotten his fancy tool. I picked it up between my fingers. It was incredibly heavy. It was cold, engraved with elegant initials right on the silver cap. A pen specifically designed to sign checks with way too many zeros and to forge contracts that ruined people's lives. I did not put it away in a desk drawer. I didn't toss it into the kitchen trash can. I walked right out the back door. I marched through the fine drizzle with the silver pen firmly in my grip, heading straight for the old wooden barn. The exact same barn where we had sold our tractor just to pay for Emily's elite college tuition. Inside, the thick smell of motor oil and damp earth wrapped around me. I walked straight over to Hank's heavy workbench. Sitting right there was a rusty old peach can that he used as a trash bin for bent nails, stripped bolts, and completely useless scraps of wire. I dropped Mr. Hayes's expensive silver pen right into the can. The fancy metal hit the rusty iron with a dull, hollow clink. That was exactly where it belonged, right in there with the useless scrap metal that served absolutely no purpose anymore. Time on the farm started moving at a very different pace from that day forward. The weeks rolled by, marked only by hard physical labor and the subtle shift in the color of the oak leaves. Autumn finally arrived in the valley with freezing mornings and incredibly short afternoons. The sun ducked early behind the hills, staining the sky a deep, bruised violet. Almost a full month after the incident in the dining room, Thomas returned to the farm. This time, he didn't wear his heavy charcoal suit. He wore a thick wool sweater and a corduroy jacket. He showed up on a Saturday morning, using the excuse that he needed to drop off the final certified copies of the trust registry for my personal files. We sat out on the wraparound porch, entirely wrapped up in heavy blankets. We drank hot coffee while we looked out toward the walnut grove, where the trees were already starting to lose their leaves for the winter. Thomas poured me a fresh cup, handed it over, and just stared out at the horizon for a long time before speaking. "I have some news from Chicago, Margaret," he finally said. His voice was low, almost blending in perfectly with the sound of the cold wind. "I thought long and hard about whether or not I should even tell you, but I believe you have the absolute right to know exactly how the things you set into motion finally ended up." I took a slow sip of my coffee. The water was the perfect temperature, bitter and piping hot. I didn't say a single word. I just waited. "Vance is not the kind of man who wastes his time, and he certainly does not waste his money," Thomas continued, resting his thermos down on the iron table. "That exact same Tuesday they went running out of here. Vance immediately executed the guarantee clause that Emily had signed in the preliminary resort agreement. She had put her downtown apartment up as collateral to cover the astronomical costs of the land surveys and the projected loss of profit for the entire project. Since she could not deliver the land, Vance collected on the debt. Legally speaking, he completely stripped her of her property in less than 15 days. I did not blink. I stared blankly at the thick trunks of the walnut trees way out in the distance. "And the lawyer? The one with the shiny silver pen?" I asked. My voice was entirely flat. Thomas let out a bitter laugh. Mr. Hayes looked like an absolute clown in front of the entire board of investors. He had personally guaranteed them that acquiring Oak Creek Farm was a mere administrative formality with some disoriented old woman. When Vance slammed the state registry report on the table, showing that bulletproof, irrevocable trust, the entire corporate law firm went into a blind panic. Hayes was immediately removed from the board of directors, and, of course, they cut the absolute weakest link in the chain. Emily was fired that exact same afternoon. They pinned the entire blame right on her, claiming she deliberately hid vital information regarding the legal status of her own mother's assets. The wind blew a little bit harder, violently shaking the bare branches of the rose bushes right in front of the porch. My daughter. The little girl who completely despised the mud, the woman who openly mocked my slow, calloused hands. She had lost her entire empire of glass. She had gambled her own home and her fancy career, fully believing that she could steal my entire life without meeting a single ounce of resistance. And she had ended up right on the street, totally crushed by the exact same legal machinery she worshipped so much. I heard from a colleague up in the city that she is currently renting a tiny little room in a rough neighborhood on the outskirts, Thomas added. He looked at me out of the corner of his eye, searching desperately for any tiny crack in my stone expression. She actually tried calling me last week. She wanted me to mediate. She wanted me to talk to you and see if you could wire her some money from the corporate account just to help her cover rent. I simply told her that my phone was strictly reserved for the legal matters of Oak Creek Farm, and I hung up on her. "You did the right thing, Thomas," I said, handing him back the empty coffee mug. "The corporation does not have any spare funds to finance anybody's greed. Every single penny this dirt produces goes right back into the dirt. She desperately wanted to play by the city's rules, and the city charged her the absolute maximum price. There is nothing else to discuss on the matter." Thomas nodded, completely accepting my hard boundary. He never mentioned Emily's name again. We sat there in silence for a while longer, keeping each other quiet company in the peace of the countryside, right until the biting midday cold forced him to head back home. That exact same winter, the farm demanded more from me than it ever had before, and I answered it with every single drop of energy I had left. We had to prep for the massive walnut harvest. The trees on the west side, those exact same trees that Mr. Vance had measured with his greedy eyes, planning to chop them down for his wooden cabins, gifted us one of the most incredibly abundant seasons I could ever remember. The branches were heavy, practically bent all the way down to the dirt under the massive weight of the green husks. Hank hired 5 temporary farmhands from the neighboring town just to help with the brutal harvest. For 3 straight weeks, the farm was an absolute beehive of activity. The dull thud of the long poles striking the high branches, the loud, rattling sound of thousands of walnuts raining down onto the heavy canvas tarps spread across the ground, the constant roar of the old tractor engine hauling massive burlap sacks. It completely filled my days. I did not stay inside the house knitting sweaters or baking lemon cakes. I put on my insulated rubber boots, threw on a thick wool coat, and I was right out there in the trenches from 6 in the morning until the sun went down. I helped sort the walnuts by hand. My fingers got stained pitch black by the natural ink of the green husks. It was a dark, stubborn color that settled deep beneath your fingernails and wouldn't wash out for days. It was the ultimate mark of hard work, the mark of true belonging. And I wore it with far more pride than any solid gold ring. But my true battlefield wasn't just out there in the wet dirt. It was in the numbers. In the late afternoons, when the farmhands retreated to wash their tools and Hank went to secure the barns, I walked right back into my bedroom. I closed the heavy door and opened up my laptop. Under the cold blue glow of the screen, the slow-handed widow vanished entirely, and the ruthless administrator of Oak Creek Farm emerged. I logged into the encrypted management system using my security token. I registered the daily weights of the burlap sacks, cross-referenced the moisture data of the crop, and most importantly, I negotiated directly with the massive wholesale buyers. I no longer relied on those greedy local middlemen who used to take huge advantage of Arthur whenever he was too exhausted to fight back. I reached out via email to a massive dried fruit export company up in Chicago, the exact same city that had just tried to swallow me whole. One freezing, brilliantly bright July morning, a massive 18-wheeler cargo truck crossed right through the main iron gates that Hank had left wide open. The massive rig hissed to a stop right near the storage barns. The driver was a heavy-set guy wearing a faux leather jacket and holding a thick clipboard. He hopped down from the cab. He looked around, evaluating the entire setup with a highly critical eye. Hank was busy organizing the hands to load the heavy sacks onto the loading ramp. The driver walked right up to him. "Morning, boss," the trucker yelled, trying to make himself heard over the loud rumble of the idling diesel engine. "I am here from the Southern Export Company. I got a work order to load up 16,000 pounds of premium butterfly walnuts. Where is the owner so I can get him to sign this manifest and we can sort out the payment?" Hank stopped exactly what he was doing. He wiped the cold sweat from his forehead with the back of his rough hand, and he pointed his chin directly toward the porch of the main house. "I am not the boss around here, buddy," Hank said. A wide smirk peeked out from underneath his gray mustache. "The owner is Mrs. Margaret. She is the one you need to talk to about the paperwork." The trucker whipped his head around. He was fully expecting to see some rich guy in a suit or a hardened farm manager in heavy coveralls. Instead, he saw me. I was standing dead still at the bottom of the porch steps. I was wearing my thick canvas work pants, a gray fleece vest layered over a flannel shirt. I was holding my open laptop, resting it flat on my left forearm exactly like a serving tray, while my right hand firmly gripped the small digital signature device. I walked toward him with an incredibly steady pace. My boots crunched against the gravel with absolute authority. The man looked me up and down, visibly thrown off. His brain, entirely accustomed to the usual countryside stereotypes, simply could not process the image of a white-haired old woman with a strict bun, casually managing the complex logistics of a massive, high-value commercial hall. "Good morning. I am Margaret, the sole administrator of the owning corporation," I said, walking right up to the heavy grill of the truck. I rested the laptop right on the freezing metal of the bumper. "I have the digital loading manifest ready in the system, but before your men lift a single sack into that trailer, I need your company's finance department to release the wire transfer we agreed upon via email." The trucker blinked hard, gripping his clipboard tightly. Yes, ma'am. My boss told me the payment was cash on delivery, but I honestly figured we would have to drive all the way down to the local bank in town to fill out the paperwork." "We do not need to go anywhere," I interrupted him. My voice was sharp and ruthlessly efficient. "Call your boss right now. Tell him the cargo is sitting on the ramp. It is fully weighed and officially certified for moisture content. Tell him to release the funds directly into the account ending in 412. I will verify the deposit right here on this screen, and then I will digitally sign your manifest." The man, still completely stunned, pulled out his cell phone and stepped a few yards away to make the call. I watched him nod repeatedly, glancing back at me with a brand new expression of absolute, undeniable respect. Exactly 10 minutes later, the inbox icon on my screen flashed. I opened the secure banking portal. The bright green numbers on the main account balance had grown massive. It reflected the exact payment down to the very last penny for the grueling work of our trees. I looked at the driver and gave him a firm, confirming nod. "The payment has officially cleared. Hank, proceed with the loading," I ordered. I stayed right there, leaning casually against the front grille of the huge truck, watching as the 100-pound burlap sacks were hauled up the ramp, one by one. Every single sack was a heavy physical testament that the old woman did, in fact, understand business. Every sack was irrefutable proof that the deep roots we had planted were infinitely stronger than any shallow city ambition. I did not need to wear expensive tailored suits or use confusing legal jargon to protect what was mine. I only needed the quiet patience of someone who knows how to plant seeds, and the absolute coldness of someone who knows exactly when to rip a weed out by its roots. When the massive truck finally pulled away, kicking up a huge cloud of gray dust into the freezing afternoon air, the silence settled back over the farm. But this time, it was a full, deeply satisfied silence. The hired hands collected their daily wages in cash, thanked us, and started the long walk back toward the highway. Hank snapped the heavy padlock shut on the barns and let the guard dogs loose. They sprinted out to patrol the perimeter, completely thrilled by the freedom of the end of the day. The sun began to hide behind the jagged mountain range, painting the high clouds with violent strokes of fire and old gold. The air turned incredibly sharp, warning us that the night was going to bring a brutal freeze. I walked slowly back toward the main house. My legs felt incredibly heavy. A deep, honest exhaustion ran down my spine. It was the exact kind of tired that lets you sleep without dreaming. I walked in through the kitchen door. The intense heat from the wood-burning stove, which Hank had lit earlier in the afternoon, welcomed me like a warm, familiar hug. I set the laptop down on the pine table. There were absolutely no more emails to send, no more digital ledgers to review. The grueling work was finally done. The massive harvest was sold. The land was completely secure. I walked back to my bedroom to take off my heavy work boots. As I walked past the cherrywood dresser, I pulled open the top drawer. Hidden right underneath the fine wool shawl, the little carved wooden box Arthur had given me was still sitting right in its place. I opened it. The small black USB device was resting peacefully right next to the antique pocket watch, permanently stopped at 3:15. It was no longer a loaded weapon. Now it was just a shield resting in peace. I closed the little box and pushed the drawer shut until I heard the solid click of the wood sliding into place. I walked back out into the hallway and headed straight for the dining room. I crossed the pitch-black room, walking right past the massive oak table where absolutely everything had been decided months ago. I didn't turn on a single light. There was no need. I reached the large glass cabinet, the display case where I kept the fine dishware. I pulled the glass doors open. The faint squeak of the hinges echoed softly in the silent house. I reached my hand blindly up to the very top shelf. Right there, shoved all the way back into the darkest corner, pressed practically against the back wood, were the bottle green porcelain cups with the gold rims. I brushed them very lightly with my fingertips. They were stone cold, already covered by a fine, sad layer of untouched dust. They were incredibly beautiful, extremely fragile, almost translucent, and they would never, ever be used again. They belonged to a completely dead past where I desperately tried to buy love by serving hot coffee on a heavy silver tray. That chapter was permanently closed. I pulled my hand out of the dark corner. Down on the bottom shelf, right within easy reach, I grabbed an entirely different cup. It was a thick, heavy ceramic mug, earth brown with a rim that was slightly chipped from years and years of hard use. It was Arthur's absolute favorite mug, the mug of a true worker. I walked into the kitchen, heated up some fresh water, and brewed myself a cup of herbal tea using the lemon verbena leaves I had dried myself under the brutal summer sun. The earthy, citrus aroma instantly flooded the room. I grabbed the brown mug by its thick handle and walked out toward the wraparound porch. I pushed the double doors open and stepped outside. The freezing night had already fallen completely over the entire valley. The sky was a deep black blanket, pierced by thousands of brilliant, freezing stars that looked like they were close enough to touch. The cold wind blew hard through the branches of the oak trees, a constant steady whisper that sounded exactly like heavy breathing. Way off in the distance, down near the corrals, I heard the short, sharp bark of one of the guard dogs. It was immediately followed by the absolute silence of a territory that was fully guarded and completely at peace. I sat down in the wicker chair, the exact same chair I had occupied for my entire life. I rested the brown mug down on the small wrought iron table. There were no fancy silver trays. There were no deceitful legal documents. There were absolutely no guests sitting there, eagerly waiting for me to trip over my own words. It was just the freezing night, the dirt, and me. I looked out toward the west. straight into the pitch-black darkness where I knew the old walnut trees were standing tall. I couldn't see them in the shadows, but I didn't need to. I knew exactly where they were. I knew the immense depth of their roots, clinging tightly to the stone and the mud. I knew they had miraculously survived brutal droughts, massive storms, and the deadly edge of a chainsaw that never even got the chance to turn on. I lifted the thick ceramic mug and took a long, slow sip of the herbal tea. The boiling heat slid right down my throat, settling deep into my chest, melting away the very last traces of the thick ice that had protected me for months. The sentinel could finally rest for the night. The battle was officially won. I leaned back against the wicker frame, crossed my hands over my lap, and just let the total silence of my home wrap completely around me. Knowing fully well that tomorrow morning, when the sun finally came back up, the land would still be standing exactly right beneath my feet.